fade in. Black and white footage flickers like an old reel, the sound of distant thunder that is not thunder. It's artillery rolling across the valleys of Italy. A mountainside shrouded in smoke. Men in torn uniforms crawl across jagged rock, their faces hollow, lips cracked from days without water. Above them looms a monastery, ancient, broken, unreachable, its silhouette flickering through the smoke like a ghost from another age. The hill is called Monte Cassino, and every man who climbs it knows that death waits somewhere among its stones. Voices shout in Polish. Naprzód. Forward! The words echo off the valley walls, swallowed by machine gun fire. A shell bursts and the world turns white. When the dust clears, the mountain has taken more suns, but the rest keep moving. Bayonets fixed, faces streaked with mud and blood. Among them marches a generation exiled from their homeland, fighting for a Poland that no longer exists on any map. Somewhere above, the abbey burns again. The smoke rises like incense twisting into the sky, an offering of sacrifice to history itself. And as the Allied generals watch in disbelief from the valley below, one truth begins to form in the hearts of men who have seen too much. The Poles will take the mountain, or they will die upon it. The Italian wind carried the scent of burned fuel and wet stone. It drifted through the shattered villages south of Rome, winding between church towers split in half and houses without roofs. It was February 1944, and the Allies had already been stopped 3 times at Monte Cassino. 3 assaults, by Americans, Britons, New Zealanders, Indians, had broken like waves against the monastery's cliffs. The Germans of the 1st Parachute Division, the Fallschirmjäger, clung to the heights like eagles, invisible but ever watching. When General Władysław Anders's Polish II Corps arrived, the men understood what awaited them. Many had crossed half the world to stand here, from the gulags of Siberia, from refugee camps in Iran and Palestine, from the deserts of North Africa. Their journey was a wound that never closed. They were soldiers without a country, their homeland carved apart by Hitler and Stalin, their families dead or vanished into the snows of the East. And yet when they looked up at Monte Cassino, they saw something more than a mountain. They saw redemption. Anders himself, tall, composed, the kind of man whose calm could steady a storm, walked among his troops in the assembly areas near Cassino. He paused beside a gun crew of the 3rd Carpathian Division, their uniforms patched, their boots caked in mud. "To nasza chwila," he said quietly. "This is our moment." The men nodded. They had waited years for a chance to prove Poland's name still meant courage. That night, snow drifted down through the valleys, soft flakes landing on the barrels of howitzers and the tarpaulins of supply trucks. Far off, the monastery was just a black outline against the moon. In its broken windows, sometimes a flicker of light. German signal lamps, or so the men believed. The abbey itself was a ruin since February's bombing, yet the Germans had turned the debris into a fortress. Every archway was a gun nest. Every fallen stone hid a sniper. Beneath the mountain, in the olive groves of the Leary Valley, life went on in silence. The engineers worked by night, dragging bridge sections across mud, laying mines, repairing roads with shovels and bare hands. The Poles had inherited positions from the New Zealanders, trenches filled with stagnant water, dugouts that smelled of rot. The men joked bitterly that Cassino was not a battle but a disease. It infected everyone who came near. In the days before the attack, Anders' staff planned meticulously. The 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division would assault the abbey from the north, climbing through the valley of the Rapido River and the cliffs of Point 593, a name that would soon be burned into history. On their right, the 5th Kresowa Division would strike toward the Phantom Ridge, the long spine of rock leading up to the monastery walls. Between them lay the Cauldron, a narrow defile under constant German fire, known simply as Death Valley. Every man memorized the map. They studied photographs, rehearsed hand signals, learned to crawl from crater to crater. The priests came through the lines offering blessings, sometimes writing letters for those who couldn't. One chaplain, Father Jan Moczka, moved between the trenches carrying a small cross carved from olive wood. "Do not pray for safety," he told them. "Pray for strength." By May 11, 1944, the valley was ready. Hundreds of guns stood silent in the dark. British 25-pounders, Polish 6-inch howitzers, American heavy artillery. The moon hid behind clouds. Every sound felt too loud. Somewhere beyond the lines, the Germans waited in the ruins, listening for the silence before a storm. At exactly 2300 hours, the night exploded. It was the most concentrated artillery barrage the Allies had fired in Italy. For 2 hours, 2,600 guns hurled steel into the mountain. The valley shook. Hills glowed red like embers. In the flashes, soldiers could see the monastery's shape appearing and vanishing as if the earth itself were breathing. The Poles advanced behind the fire, shadows crawling through dust, whispering to each other over the roar. Machine guns raked them from hidden slopes. Mortars burst overhead, showering rock and blood. The 3rd Carpathians clawed their way toward Point 593, but the ground was alive with mines. Men vanished in bursts of flame, their screams lost in the bombardment. Still they climbed, dragging the wounded, firing blindly into the dark. By dawn, the attack had stalled. The slopes were littered with bodies, their hands still clutching rifles. Anders ordered the assault renewed that evening. He knew what the cost would be, but he also knew retreat was impossible. The mountain had become a symbol too heavy to abandon. When the sun rose on May 12th, the 5th Kresoa Division began its push toward Phantom Ridge. They fought up narrow ledges under sniper fire, clinging to roots, pulling themselves over stone ledges slick with blood. It was fighting so close that men stabbed each other with entrenching tools. By nightfall, they had gained only a few yards. The next day, the Germans counterattacked. From the rubble of the abbey poured paratroopers in camouflaged smocks, firing from hip, shouting Fallschirmjäger. The Poles met them with grenades and bayonets. The mountain became a labyrinth of smoke and screams. When one hilltop was taken, another burst into fire. When one machine gun nest fell silent, 2 more opened. But amid the chaos, something had changed. The Poles did not fall back. They had come too far, from Siberia, from Persia, from exile, and to stop now. Their commanders walked among them, shouting over the din. General Bronisław Duch, commander of the 3rd Carpathians, climbed to a forward trench under shell fire. "Hold fast," he said simply, and they did. By May 17th, the Germans began to withdraw. They had fought to the last round, but the Polish advance was relentless. That night, as the valley burned below, a small patrol led by Captain Władysław Wojtyra crept up the final slope. When dawn came, a white and red flag rippled above the ruins and the flag of Poland. Below, thousands of men watched from their trenches, too exhausted to cheer. Some wept silently. Others knelt in the mud and crossed themselves. The monastery was theirs. The mountain, finally taken, but at a cost that stunned even their enemies. When the smoke cleared, 923 Polish soldiers lay dead on Monte Cassino, and more than 3,000 wounded. The cemetery built in the days that followed would become holy ground. On its gate, an inscription carved in stone reads, "For our freedom and yours, we soldiers of Poland gave our soul to God, our life to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland." The world took notice. Newspapers in London and Washington carried the headline, "Poles take Monte Cassino." For the first time in years, the name Poland stood beside victory, but for the men who survived, victory was hollow. When they looked to the east, their homeland was gone, swallowed by the Red Army and a new frontier. Anders's soldiers had liberated a mountain, but lost a nation. Still, on that Italian hill, amid the graves of comrades and the ruins of an ancient abbey, they stood as free men. And for a brief eternal moment, the world remembered them. Dawn broke over the shattered ridge like a wound reopening. The mountain smoldered, a vast cathedral of smoke where stone walls once stood. For the men of the Polish II Corps, the battle was not finished. It had only changed its face. The flag over the abbey was a signal, not an ending. The German rearguard still clung to the terraces below, and the slopes were haunted by snipers who refused to yield. The sky itself seemed poisoned by cordite and ash. Anders watched from his forward command post, binoculars raised, his coat stiff with dust. Below him, the slopes of Monte Cassino were alive with movement. Stretchers carried down by stumbling medics, engineers marking safe paths through minefields with white tape, gun crews sweating over their howitzers in silence. Each explosion echoed across the valley like a heartbeat. He could see the faces of his men as they returned from the heights, eyes rimmed with red, beards unshaven, uniforms shredded by rock. They looked older than they had a week ago, as if the mountain had stolen years from them. And yet when the general passed, they straightened. They saluted with hands still trembling from battle. Anders nodded once, expression unreadable. He knew their victory had come at a price too steep to celebrate. Beyond Cassino, the road to Rome lay open. But to reach it, the Allies needed to cross the Liri Valley, still under fire from German artillery. The rain returned that night, falling in fine sheets that turned the battlefield into a swamp of mud and broken helmets. Trucks bogged down in the gullies. Mules slipped and died in the ditches. The smell of death thickened, a mixture of cordite, decay, and wet earth. In the flicker of lightning, the abbey appeared once more, its arches hollow, its stones smoking. Chaplains climbed to the ruins carrying candles protected by helmets, searching for the bodies of those who had fallen near the altar. They found rifles leaning against walls, canteens half full, rosaries clutched in stiff hands. Inside what was once the great hall of St. Benedict, rain dripped through holes in the roof onto a floor littered with torn uniforms, German and Polish, indistinguishable. Below in the valley, life resumed its mechanical rhythm of war. The engineers built bridges across the Rapido River, their torches throwing sparks into the mist. Sappers waded waist-deep into icy water, fixing pontoons under fire. From the hills came the groan of tank engines, Shermans and Churchills grinding forward, each tread sinking into mud like slow thunder. On their sides, hastily painted red-white Polish insignia blurred in the rain. For the men of the 5th Kresowa Division, rest never truly came. They bivouacked among olive trees that still bore the scars of bullets, sharing tins of cold meat and silence. Letters arrived from home, some months old, others addressed to places that no longer existed. Private Jan Kowalewski unfolded one beneath the dim light of a burning candle. It was from his mother in Lwów, written before the Soviets came. When this is over, it said, come home to the orchard. He folded it slowly, his face unreadable. He knew there was no orchard left to return to. That same night, Anders met with General Oliver Leese of the British 8th Army in a damp tent that smelled of coffee and diesel. Maps spread across the table, corners held down by shell casings. Leese congratulated him in the polite tones of an officer who knows how much it cost. You've done what no one else could, Anders, he said. The Pole nodded, but his eyes were elsewhere, fixed on the small red circle drawn around Cassino. We did what we had to, he answered. Nothing more. Outside rain hammered the canvas. A courier entered with new orders. The Poles were to press on northward toward Ancona. The fight would not end at Cassino. It would roll up the spine of Italy like a storm that refused to die. By June, the hills turned green again. Poppies grew among the wrecks of trucks and tanks. The cemetery at Monte Cassino took shape, neat white crosses in perfect rows. The chaplains recited names one by one, their voices echoing across the valley. Women from nearby villages brought flowers, silent, eyes lowered. To them, the Poles were heroes. To the Poles themselves, only survivors. When General Anders visited the cemetery for the first time, he walked alone. The wind flooded the flag at half-mast and the smell of wild thyme rose from the ground. He stopped before a grave marked simply Nieznany Żołnierz, unknown soldier. He removed his cap. They will remember us, he whispered, though he wasn't sure whom he meant, the world or history or God. Far away in London, the Allied press ran headlines of triumph. Photographs of Polish soldiers standing atop the ruined abbey filled newspapers. Faces blackened with soot, eyes bright with exhaustion. The captions read, Poles capture Monte Cassino. For most readers, it was a line of victory among many. For those who had fought there, it was the story of everything they had lost. Among the men, stories began to circulate, of comrades who vanished in smoke, of German paratroopers who fought to the last, of priests giving last rites in shell holes. In every campfire conversation, there was one refrain, Cassino will never leave us. Some laughed bitterly, others simply stared into the flames. War photographers arrived to capture what was left. They moved carefully among the ruins, stepping over helmets and bones half buried in ash. Through their lenses, the world saw a mountain stripped bare, trees reduced to splinters, stones melted by fire, the abbey standing like a skeleton against the sky. The images would appear in museums decades later, but for the soldiers who were there, the real picture was burned into memory, the smell, the noise, the trembling earth beneath their boots, and then came the orders to move again. Trucks lined the roads north, engines coughing, canvas flapping in the wind. The Poles left Cassino behind, a silent monument of smoke fading into the horizon. For many, It was like leaving a grave they could never visit again. The valley grew smaller in the rearview mirrors, until it was only a shadow between hills. The next battle would come soon. It always did. But none would carry the same weight. Monte Cassino had been more than a fight for ground. It was a resurrection. The men who survived carried that weight in their silence. When they spoke, it was only to tell each other what they already knew, that the mountain had taken the best of them and left behind only ghosts. The road north wound through valleys that smelled of pine and dust where the sound of guns faded behind the hills. For the men of the Polish II Corps, silence was harder to bear than battle. It reminded them of everything they had left behind. The empty farms in the east, the long trains heading toward Siberia, the voices that never came back. Each morning, the columns moved forward under a sun that burned away the mist. Trucks loaded with ammunition and blankets rattled past ox carts filled with Italian peasants returning to their ruins. Children waved at the soldiers, sometimes holding up wilted flowers, sometimes just staring with the solemn curiosity of those who had seen too much. The Poles smiled back, threw them tins of food, and kept walking. In the evenings, the mountains turned blue. Fires flickered among the olive groves where the troops camped. The men ate in silence, listening to the wind and the occasional howl of a dog somewhere beyond the ridge. It was a strange peace, fragile, temporary, threaded with the memory of what they had endured. In those quiet nights, the ghosts began to speak. They came not as specters, but as memories. A sudden flash of light in a dream, a whisper from a trench, a hand on a shoulder that wasn't there. The veterans of Cassino could not close their eyes without seeing the slopes again, the jagged rocks, the white monastery burning above them. Private Antoni Zielinski woke screaming one night, convinced he was still crawling up Point 593. His comrades calmed him, gave him water, and stared into the dark, each silently admitting they felt the same. For every man who had survived, there was another whose name they still called out during roll. Chaplain Father Monska wrote in his diary, "The men confess not to me, but to the earth. They speak to the ground as though it listens. They ask if the souls of their brothers are at peace. I have no answer, only silence." When they reached Ancona, the city was still under German control. The Poles were ordered to take it. The campaign stretched through June and July, a slow grind of artillery and house-to-house fighting. But compared to Cassino, it was almost merciful. The enemy retreated faster than before. The war was shifting. The port fell in mid-July, and for the first time since they left home, the soldiers of the Second Corps stood before the sea. Many stared at it in silence and the endless horizon glittering under the Italian sun. Some took off their boots and waded into the water, laughing like children. The sea felt like absolution, but even here the ghosts followed. In hospitals across southern Italy, the wounded of Cassino still lingered. Some were blind, some missing limbs, some speaking only to themselves. Nurses moved quietly among them, their footsteps soft on the tile floors. One man carved the shape of the abbey into a piece of wood, over and over until his fingers bled. Another refused to sleep unless someone sang him the Polish hymn Boże coś Polska. The doctors did what they could, but no medicine could treat what Cassino had left behind, the emptiness that lived behind the eyes of every survivor. News reached them that Warsaw had risen, that their brothers and sisters were fighting the Germans in the streets. The men crowded around radios, listening to static and distant voices. Hope returned, fierce and dangerous. For weeks they believed they might soon go home, but the reports grew darker. The uprising was crushed. The Soviets had stopped on the far bank of the Vistula, watching as the city burned. Anders read the dispatches in silence, then gathered his officers. "Do not tell the men everything," he said. "They will know soon enough." When the truth spread, it was like another shell burst through their hearts. The camp fell silent. No songs that night, no laughter. Only the slow crackle of the fires and the wind over the sea. Sergeant Józef Lato, who had carried the Polish flag up the slopes of Cassino, sat alone by the water. "We gave everything," he murmured. "And for what? Poland is dying while we fight for strangers." The British officers admired Anders's discipline. His soldiers obeyed, never broke ranks, never mutinied. But they did not see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The Poles were proud, but they were also lost. Their homeland had been traded once again in conferences far away. Yalta, Tehran, names that meant nothing to men who had buried friends in foreign soil. Anders visited the hospitals and field camps, shaking hands, listening, offering quiet words. To one young officer who asked if it had all been worth it, he said only, "History will decide." But he knew history was rarely kind. In London, diplomats argued over borders. In Moscow, Stalin prepared his own version of Poland, a state loyal to him, built on the graves of those who had fought against both tyrannies. The Polish II Corps, though victorious in Italy, found itself politically orphaned. They were heroes without a home. When Rome was liberated, Anders and his men were invited to march in the Allied parade. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, the air alive with confetti and music. The Polish banners fluttered in the sun, red and white against a sea of khaki. Yet the soldiers marched in silence, their eyes forward. For them, it was not triumph. It was farewell. At the head of the column, Anders saluted as they passed the reviewing stand. Cameras clicked, generals smiled, and the crowd roared. But for every flash of a camera, there was the memory of a grave on a distant hill. When the parade ended, Anders turned to his adjutant and said, "We have shown the world who we are. Now let us pray it remembers." That night, back at camp, the men gathered in small groups, cleaning weapons that would soon be sent to other fronts. The war was ending, they were told. Soon they would go home. But they already knew home no longer existed, not the one they had left. Private Kowalewski unfolded his mother's letter again, the paper now worn thin at the folds. He looked out toward the horizon, where lightning flickered beyond the sea. "If she's gone," he said softly, "then all I have left is this uniform." The chaplain walked among them, his cross catching the last of the firelight. "You have your memories," he said. "And your brothers." "That is enough." But even he did not believe it. The ghosts of victory were everywhere, in the rustle of olive leaves, in the distant roll of thunder, in the faces of men who could not sleep. The war had given them purpose, but it had taken their future. And as they waited for orders that never came, they began to understand the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes victory is just another kind of loss. The war was ending, but not for them. When the news reached the Polish II Corps that Germany had surrendered, there were no cheers, only silence. Some men stared at the ground, others removed their caps. It was May 1945, and the Italian sun was gentle again, warm enough to dry the olive leaves and erase the stench of cordite. The bells of nearby villages rang for peace, but the sound fell strangely hollow among the rows of white crosses at Monte Cassino. For most Allied troops, victory meant going home. For the Poles, it meant something else entirely, a deeper, quieter exile. Their homeland, the reason they had fought, was now a prisoner of a new empire. The Soviet shadow lay across Warsaw, Krakow, Lwów. The same Red Army that had once marched with them through the ruins of Europe now held the keys to Poland itself. General Władysław Anders stood before his men at a makeshift parade ground near Loreto. The air smelled of pine and damp stone. Thousands of soldiers gathered in formation, men who had marched across continents, who had fought through hell, who had raised the white and red over Monte Cassino. Anders's face was grave, his voice calm but edged with sorrow. "We have fought for freedom," he said, his words carried by the wind. "And though the world may forget, we have shown it what freedom costs. We will not return to a land that is no longer free. Our fight continues, not with rifles, but with memory." A long silence followed. Then quietly a few men began to sing, "Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła." Poland is not yet lost. The others joined, their voices rough, uncertain, but unbroken. The anthem drifted across the valley like a prayer. The months that followed were a strange limbo. The II Corps remained in Italy, stationed among villages that had become like home to them. Italian families, grateful for liberation, invited the Poles into their houses, offered them bread, wine, and laughter. Children followed the soldiers through the streets, calling them I nostri Polacchi, our Poles. Friendships formed, even love. Weddings were held in bombed-out churches with broken stained glass. Photographs from those days show soldiers in worn uniforms, flowers tucked into their rifle barrels, smiling beside Italian brides whose veils were sewn from parachute silk. In the midst of ruin, life insisted on being born again. But under every smile lay the same wound. They had no country to return to. Letters from Poland were rare and censored. Many learned through whispers that their families had vanished, deported east, imprisoned, or worse. The Allied command offered them choices: resettlement in Britain, service in occupation forces, or return to Poland under Soviet supervision. For most, the last was unthinkable. They had fought too long to fall under another tyranny. So they waited, months then years, for some resolution that never came. In the summer of 1946, the order finally arrived. The Polish II Corps was to be transferred to Britain. Ships waited at Naples, gray silhouettes against the morning sea. The men packed their few belongings: photographs, medals, letters, bits of stone from Cassino's slopes. They boarded in silence, the air heavy with the scent of salt and oil. As the ships pulled away, many stood at the rails watching the Italian coast recede. They could see the faint outline of Monte Cassino far inland, a dark tooth against the horizon. Some saluted. Others simply stared until the mountain disappeared into mist. The voyage was long and quiet. The deck smelled of diesel and sea spray. At night, the veterans gathered in small groups, speaking softly in Polish, the language itself feeling like a piece of home they could still hold. Some sang old songs, O mój Rosmarini. Others carved initials into the wooden railings. When they reached Britain, the sky was gray, the air cool and foreign. The ships docked at Liverpool, Portsmouth, Glasgow, names that sounded like another world. Crowds gathered to welcome them, waving flags, cheering "Bravo Poland." But behind the warmth lay bureaucracy. They were soldiers of an army that no longer existed, citizens of a country that now belonged to someone else. They were given papers, numbers, and barracks in old camps across the countryside. Some found work on farms or in factories. Others, unable to adjust, drifted from place to place. Many never took off their uniforms, not out of pride, but because they had nothing else to wear. Anders spent his final years in exile, living in London, a general without an army, a patriot without a nation. His office walls were lined with photographs of the men he had led, faces of the fallen faded black and white. Each morning he stood before them in silence, as though addressing them once more. When asked if he regretted anything, he would answer, "Only that I could not bring them home. In 1970 he died, and in his will he requested to be buried among his soldiers at Monte Cassino." When the coffin arrived in Italy draped in the Polish flag, thousands came. Veterans in their old uniforms, Italians who still remembered, priests, widows, and children. As the casket was lowered into the earth beside his men, the trumpets played Cisa. The wind carried it through the ruins, over the valley and up toward the monastery walls. Time moved on, as it always does. The graves at Cassino grew older, the inscriptions softened by rain. Tourists came with cameras, historians with notebooks, but for those who had fought there, the mountain never faded. In Britain, they built small communities, Polish halls, churches, schools. They taught their children the stories their homeland could no longer tell. "Remember Cassino," they said. "Remember who we were." Some returned to Poland after the fall of communism decades later. They walked through cities rebuilt on bones, stood before monuments that mentioned none of their names. One veteran, now an old man with trembling hands, placed a small Polish flag at the Warsaw Uprising Memorial and whispered, "We never stopped fighting." For others, exile became home. The fields of England and the coasts of Scotland were dotted with Polish names on gravestones. They had fought for a free world, and the world had moved on, but their story remained quiet and enduring, in the hearts of those who understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep faith. The camera pans across the Monte Cassino cemetery one last time, rows upon rows of white crosses, the sun setting over the Leary Valley, the inscription carved in stone, "For our freedom and yours." The wind rises through the cypress trees, carrying the faint echo of voices, the song of soldiers who once climbed the mountain and changed the course of history. Their victory was not in land or power, but in remembrance. In the knowledge that even in exile, even in silence, they had remained free men, and in the soft Italian twilight, it feels as though the mountain itself remembers Ike and every stone, every scar, every name whispered to the wind. The years that followed were quiet ones, too quiet for men who had lived through the thunder. War had been their heartbeat. Peace felt like an echo that never returned. The Polish II Corps no longer existed on any map, but its veterans carried it everywhere, in the rhythm of their marches across London pavements, in the smell of gun oil that never left their coats, in the way they folded letters even decades later as though they were still in the field. Their medals gathered dust in drawers, their uniforms stored in attics where the moths made slow work of history. But memory is a stubborn thing. It survives in the cracks where history forgets to look. In the English Midlands, a small community of Poles built a church with their own hands. Its walls were whitewashed, its altar made of oak taken from a local forest. Every May they gathered to sing Mass for the fallen of Monte Cassino. Children who had never seen Poland knelt beside fathers who had not spoken of it in years. On those mornings, the veterans would stand outside after Mass, caps in hand, the air thick with the smell of wet grass and incense. They would talk about the old days, not about glory, but about comrades. They remembered faces more than battles. A laugh, a song, a cigarette passed in the dark before an attack. Inside, the choir sang, Czerwone maki na Monte Cassino, the red poppies on Monte Cassino. The song, written during the battle itself, had outlived its authors. Its words spoke of blood turned to flowers, of sacrifice blooming on stone. Each note rose like a ghost drifting up toward the rafters where sunlight cut through dust. For a few minutes the men were young again. They could almost smell the smoke of the valley, feel the weight of the rifle, hear the command echo through the fog. Then the song ended, and the years settled back around them like old coats. Across Europe, the world rebuilt itself. New wars began, new borders were drawn, and the story of Monte Cassino faded into textbooks and footnotes. The photographs remained, grainy, imperfect, haunting, but the names behind them grew quiet. In Poland, under Soviet rule, the veterans of Anders's army were forbidden to speak of their service. They were labeled traitors, Western mercenaries, enemies of the people. Their medals were hidden, their stories whispered only at kitchen tables after dark. One woman, a widow of a casino soldier, kept her husband's letters buried beneath the floorboards for 40 years. When communism fell, she brought them out again, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. If I die here, remember that I died as a free man. She took the letters to her grandson and said, This is your inheritance. Not land, not gold, freedom. In the 1990s, the cemetery at Monte Cassino was restored. The white stones gleamed again under the Italian sun. Veterans came from around the world, from Britain, Canada, Australia, Argentina. Old men in ill-fitting suits, medals pinned over frail hearts, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. They moved slowly between the rows, touching names they hadn't spoken in decades. One of them, now 90, bent to place a small wooden cross at the grave of a friend. His hands shook as he whispered, We did it, Josek, they remember now. Above, the abbey had been rebuilt, not as it was, but as a symbol. Bells rang again from its tower, their sound carrying across the valley like forgiveness. On the walls inside, a plaque bore an inscription in Polish and Italian. To the soldiers who fell for the freedom of mankind. Film reels rediscovered in archives began to surface. Footage of the assault, of men crawling through smoke, of flags rising through ruin. Historians called it one of the fiercest battles of the war, but those who had been there knew better. It was not just a battle. It was the moment an erased nation carved its name back into the world. Young filmmakers and documentarians came to interview the survivors. The veterans spoke softly, sometimes through tears. They told of comrades who sang before dying, of chaplains who prayed over bodies in the rain, of the mountain that never let them go. When asked why they had fought, one old soldier smiled faintly and said, Because someone had to show the world we still existed. Decades later, a new generation of Polish cadets climbed Monte Cassino. Their boots struck the same stones, their flags carried the same colors. They stood at the top of the hill before the graves and saluted. Cameras clicked, but the silence that followed was more powerful than any speech. The wind was warm that day. The valley below shimmered with sunlight. A few veterans watched from wheelchairs, tears tracing the lines of their faces. They saw themselves in the young, the same pride, the same burden. At noon, the bugler played Chisa. The note lingered in the air, bending softly over the graves. A flock of birds lifted from the cypress trees, wheeling once before disappearing into the light, and for a brief, impossible moment, it felt as though the mountain was alive again, filled with the voices of those who had fallen, whispering through the wind, "We are still here." The narrator's voice fades low, steady. History remembers the victors, but not always the price of victory. The Poles at Monte Cassino fought not for land, nor empire, but for the idea that freedom must exist somewhere, even if it was only on a single mountain of stone. They fought knowing they might never see their homeland again, and they climbed anyway. When the world looked away, they became its conscience. When nations forgot their names, they wrote them into the rock with blood. And when silence fell over Europe, their song endured, soft as prayer, strong as truth. The camera tilts upward from the graves to the sky. Clouds drift slowly over the ruins of the abbey, sunlight spilling through them like grace. Because somewhere in every struggle for freedom, there is a mountain like Cassino. And somewhere in every generation there are men and women willing to climb it. Fade to black.